next Neely series, which will be held on Thursday, March 20th at 7:30 p.m. Note the 7:30. We usually meet at 7, and it will be with Robert James Miller, Professor of American Indian Law at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Professor Miller's presentation will focus on the doctrine of discovery and how England, France, Holland, and the USA used international law to claim dominance over Indigenous peoples and ownership of the very lands these people occupied. And also, for the Neely series, looking ahead to April, the River Campus Libraries is really proud to announce a new outreach program called UR Reads. The first book in this reading series is Someone Knows My Name, an award-winning book by author Lawrence Hill. A presentation and discussion will be held on April 9th at 7 p.m. and note now the other location in Hoyt Auditorium, Hoyt Hall. Please think about reading the book. It's excellent, and joining us for what will be a very interesting discussion with Mr. Hill. Now for this evening, our guest speaker, Walter Stahr, will be introduced by Professor Tom Slaughter, the Arthur R. Miller Professor and Professor of History, and editor of the publication Reviews in American History. Dr. Slaughter has been instrumental. He's got a very large biography, but we're going to focus on one thing that we think is really special. Has been instrumental in collaborating with the River Campus Libraries, namely staff in the Digital Humanities Center and in Rare Books and Special Collections, to introduce the University of Rochester graduate and undergraduate students to the Seward family 19th century papers. And the Seward family, as we know, hailed from Auburn, New York. Professor Slaughter teaches two classes that use the manuscript collection, the Seward Family's Civil War and the Seward Family in Peace and in War. With hands-on experience creating and designing websites, the students are learning about the history of the Seward family through transcribing, editing, and annotating correspondence from these papers, which are situated in Rare Books and Special Collections. One of our students, Jordan Shapiro, has curated the exhibit at the back, and I'd like to draw your attention to that, and that's how we're using our manuscript collection to really enliven our students' academic life. They get a really great hands-on experience, and it's really special that one of our students is able to produce something like this for us tonight. Professor Slaughter, getting back to the experiential learning process of these courses, they've been an absolute hit with our students, and we have a few of our students here tonight. And they immerse themselves in the lives, in this case, of the Seward family, while at the same time learning 21st century digital media skills. Professor Slaughter is currently researching material for two books. One is a history of the Seward family, with a focus on the immediate family of William Henry Seward, State Senator and Governor, U.S. Senator and Secretary of State. The second book in process is on the first four presidents in retirement, which is tentatively entitled Founding Grandfathers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tom Slaughter, who will introduce Walter Stahr. And I want to mention one more housekeeping item. Mr. Stahr's book is for sale at the back of the room, and he will be, after the lecture, happy to sign books for you. Thank you, and welcome, Tom.
Thanks. I think I'm going to change the title of that book. I kind of like Founding Geezers better the more I work on it. But yeah, we've spent the last year and a half working our way into, I wouldn't say through, but working our way into the family papers in the Seward collection, which because they are not indexed and because they are not all microfilmed and because there are elusive trails that we've followed to find the Sewards, make them all the more fascinating to us when we do find them in their papers. And so we know when big family events occur. We know how family members feel. We know when they're sad and when they're happy. We know a lot about their personalities and the ups and the downs that any family and any person has in a life. But the deeper and deeper we get into the family papers, the less and less we feel that we know about William Henry Seward, because he's in the public papers. He's not there when the baby gets sick and eventually dies. He's not there when all the children are born, is he? And we miss him. We know the Sewards love Dad. They love Henry. They call him Henry always. He's always called Henry. I think when he's young, he liked to be called Hank. But the family always calls him Henry. And we know Henry's off doing great things in the world. We know it's really important that Henry's not home. But we often are sad that we don't know his heart, that we don't know exactly his mind on some things. And so we are really, really thrilled to have someone here who knows Henry, who knows William Henry Seward ever so much better than we do. We know, I mean, I tell everybody this story about walking into the reading room in Rare Books and Special Collections last year, and one of our students now, who's moved on, was there sobbing. And I said, what happened? What's wrong? Was it a breakup of a relationship? Grandmother died. What's wrong? What's wrong? Aunt Clary died. Well, Aunt Clary died 160 years ago. But we feel really close to these people, and the experience of having the letters, the ink and the paper, the signatures, the yours. How does Francis sign the letters? Your own Francis. It's always your own Francis. We know these people very, very well, and we're very eager to get to know Henry or William better than we do. So if you were to go through the public papers, which are vast, and so Mr. Stahr has been through far more of the letters than we'll get through, but we'll take longer to do it. You might start by reading books about Henry, or books that are about Henry and that larger world in which he was such an important person, clearly one of the most important politicians of the 19th century, a man who some of us, those of us truly devoted Seward followers, believe if it weren't for the fact that the Republicans had their convention in Illinois, we might have had a president's paper. We would have had president's papers here. But as always, the convention's in Chicago. You know who's going to win. We go back, if we're looking for books about Mr. Seward, we go back, he died in 1872, back 1874. There's one by Gideon Wells that isn't at all flattering about Lincoln and Seward. There's an autobiography that his son and daughter-in-law work on and publish. There's reminiscences by one of his sons. Frederick Bancroft writes a biography in 1910. There's this book by Earl Conrad that we're reading in 1960, and we argue about whether this is a bad piece of fiction or a bad piece of history. And I'm not sure. I think the students are, where are you now? Bad fiction, because there's a lot more dialogue in this book than we find in the letters. But I keep saying, but is he right? So no, he's written a work of either history or fiction that's wrong, the students say. So that's 1916, very much a product of its times in a way that I think is quite glorious, right? I mean, he psychoanalyzes Francis in a way that leads some to throw the book, and others to think that, wow, we've made a bit of progress since 1960. Then there was Glendon Van Duzen's, who we all know well because Professor Van Duzen was responsible for getting the Seward papers here in baskets, in boxes, in trunks, in an attic. Many of them were, and they are much better off here. But they descended on the university late 1940s, early 1950s, in huge numbers that must have flooded the poor archivists back in the, wherever Rare Books and wasn't it down here? Was it down here back then? Is that where it was? Back where the reference area is in the library? Professor Van Dusen wrote a very fine political biography that stood for decades as the best piece of political biography about Mr. Seward. And it's, 1967. The family isn't terribly present, but we learn a good bit about the political life of William Henry Seward in that book. Then there was another one in 1991 that you all haven't read. I have spared you that experience, but maybe next year's class we'll get to read John Taylor's William Henry Seward, Lincoln's Right Hand, a book that is also a political biography. In the 21st century, though, we've had two that the students have connected with much better than the others. Some of the others they don't connect with as well because they're bad fiction. Some of them they don't connect with as well because they're from the 1960s and they take a sort of traditional political historian's view of both politics and of the role of individuals in politics, leaders in politics, so they don't connect up with that perhaps as well as they would have if we were teaching these books 20 or 30 years ago. But they do connect up with two books. They do connect with two books. They do find the Sewards they know, the Sewards they admire, in some cases the Sewards they love. They don't find out what went wrong with Gus, which is still one of the big questions we have. This lively, charming little boy turns into, from all the photos we have, this dour, withdrawn man who stands apart from the rest of the family. And so they're still troubled about Gus, but that's not a big deal to anybody except us because we keep the manuscripts that we're working with in Gus's closet. That's where they're locked right now. But Doris Kearns Goodwin in Team of Rivals, a book that's about Lincoln's cabinet, actually does a good bit with the family. I like to think, and I'm not putting this belief onto the students, but I think Doris Kearns Goodwin is at her best when she's wandering off her point. She's kind of the Garrison Keillor of American historians, except she's not as funny. But the story meanders, and she never lets the fact that her point is X keep her from telling a really good story that takes her out here and back there again. So that's where we find the families, and those stories that seem to be coming off wasn't this a book about Nixon? Wasn't this book about Lincoln's cabinet? No, it's about Francis. No, it's about Fanny. No, it's about a really good story, and it keeps going. But Mr. Stahr does not wander so far. He has written what we find to be the best political biography of William Henry Seward that we've got. It's not dated. It's not fiction. It has that public Henry that we don't find, that we don't know, because he's not, in the way that the archives was organized in the 1950s, he's not even a family member. His papers are separate from those of the rest of the family. So it's to Mr. Stahr's book that we go and we say, if we want to know what's in Henry's heart, if we want to know what Henry's actually thinking, if we want to know what Henry's actually out there doing when he misses all three of the cholera epidemics as they come through Auburn, New York, this is where we're going to go. And so we are, and I hope you are too, very pleased that we have Mr. Stahr here to talk to us about William Henry Seward.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Am I on? Okay. I could have talked all night about the family, but I want to talk about Seward, more of the public person. He's born in Florida, New York in 1801. He's a bright boy. I think one of those precocious kids that annoys everyone else. Goes to school, first at a grammar school, then at Union College, then reads law, and settles in Auburn. Why Auburn is a little bit of a mystery. I think if he'd been more of a canal man, he might well have settled here in Rochester. The canal was under construction in the early 1820s when he settled in Auburn. But he wasn't a canal man. He was an opponent of the canal at that point, and so he chose Auburn. He's here, though, in Rochester often. I know that he's here for the first time as early as 1824 because he meets his best friend here in Rochester, Thurlow Weed is working as a newspaper man at the time. Seward's carriage breaks down, and Weed emerges from the crowd to help Seward get the carriage out of the mud. And the friendship is formed that lasts until Seward's death.
I'm just making it louder from this part.
Okay. In 1830, Seward is elected to the New York State Senate, serves there for 4 years, returns to Auburn and his law practice for a few years. He's not always happy as a lawyer. And in the mid-1830s, some friends persuade him to take a job as the land agent for the Holland Land Company, way out in the western part of the state. And so he spends 2 years in the mid-1830s kind of commuting between Auburn, where his wife and children remain, and Westfield, which, if you've driven to Ohio, it's kind of the last thing before you get to the Welcome to Pennsylvania sign. Nowadays, you can do it in 3 hours maybe, but it took him 3 days on the Erie Canal, and so I know from that he was through Rochester often on his way back and forth. It's during that period, Professor Slaughter alluded to the death of one of his children. He's out in Westfield, he gets a letter, she's dying, he makes it in 2 days, a sort of record time, in time to see his child expire. He disentangles himself from the land office to run for governor. Actually, this is his second run for governor. He ran in 1834 as a very young man. He's still quite young when he becomes governor in 1838. Governors are important people today, but they're even more important in the 19th century. Think about it. There is no federal Department of Education or Transportation or Energy. All of these are state issues for the governor to work out with the legislature. One of his main causes as governor is education, and in particular the education of the children of immigrants. There are thousands of Catholic kids in New York City that aren't going to school at all at this time. They're not going to school because the, quote, public schools of New York City use Protestant texts and are thus unacceptable to Catholic parents. And the Catholic schools have been overwhelmed by the flood of immigrants arriving from Ireland. And Seward thinks that every child should be educated, regardless of his or her religion, and mounts a crusade, really, to get legislation through the legislature to improve the education, to provide a public education to these Catholic children. Another of his major causes is transportation. He has come around 180 degrees from that earlier opposition to the Erie Canal. He pushes through legislation to widen the Erie Canal, to build other canals, to build railroads using public funds. He sees these as not merely about transportation. He sees them as knitting the nation together, to bring the different parts of New York State, to bring the different parts of the United States more closely together. Another of his causes, not one that he really chose, is slavery. 3 men come to New York after having helped a slave escape from Virginia. The state of Virginia sends a formal extradition request to Governor Seward. Send them back. After delaying for a while, he doesn't want this to become an election issue, he writes back to say, there is no law in New York that makes one man the property of another. And an extended correspondence goes on between him and the governor of Virginia, which is publicized. The government of Virginia threatens to impede trade with New York. He becomes is almost backed into a position as a leading opponent of the extension of slavery. 4 years as governor, goes back to his law practice in Auburn for a few years. I say in Auburn, but whenever he's, quote, in Auburn, as Professor Slaughter says, he's only there briefly and temporarily. He travels extensively, both for his law practice and just for pleasure. He had seen more of the United States than probably any other politician of his generation. In early 1849, he's sent to Washington as one of New York's federal senators. And he serves 12 years in the Senate, gives a lot of famous speeches in the Senate, but perhaps his most famous speech of all is not on the Senate floor, but right here in Rochester, in October of 1858. He's helping a friend, Edwin Morgan, in his campaign to become the first Republican governor of New York. He's helping to kind of, the Republican Party has existed for a couple of years, but it's still a new thing. It's still sort of finding its way, and Seward is helping it in its election campaign. He speaks at something called Corinthian Hall, which was a huge lecture hall downtown, and it's packed. And according to one observer, there was a young man in the audience. He said that when Seward arrived on the stage and the people were applauding, he sort of stood there, quote, in the most inelegant of postures, with his hands deep in his pants pocket, just listening. And then, as the audience finally quieted down, he said to them in a loud voice, "Are you in earnest?" And they roared back their approval. And then when it quieted down again, he said, "Good, so am I." And thus, even before he begins his formal speech, Seward connects himself with his audience. And what does he say in this formal speech? I've got the full text there, but I'm going to paraphrase. He says there are two systems in the United States, a slave system and a free labor system. And although those systems have coexisted for a long time, they cannot, in his view, coexist forever. There is an irrepressible conflict between the two systems, which means that the United States must someday become entirely free or entirely slave. It means that the fields of New York and the factories of New York must one day again be manned with and tilled by slaves, or New Orleans and South Carolina will become great free ports. It goes on to say that in his view, freedom will prevail. It will prevail, in his view, peacefully and constitutionally. He doesn't say too much more, though, about exactly how this is going to happen. And one of the criticisms of this great speech is that he could have, and perhaps should have, said a bit more about how he thought the United States could get from where it was, with substantial and profitable slave operations throughout the South, to his promised land of freedom. The speech is reported not just here in Rochester, not just in New York, but throughout the nation. He's already the leading candidate to be the Republican presidential candidate in 1860, but if it did anything, it cements his position as the leader. He then does, as those of you who heard the radio interview today, a curious thing. He spends almost all of 1859 out of the country. His friends thought that it would be better to have him in Europe meeting dignitaries than giving speeches in the United States. They were worried that he might say something else even more quotable. Comes back, early 1860 goes well for him, and by the time of the convention, May 1860, he is the odds-on favorite to become the nominee. It's not as if Abraham Lincoln is utterly unknown. He's on the radar screen. Harper's publishes a sort of photo gallery of a dozen Republican candidates. Seward is right there in the middle, in a larger photo than anyone else has. But Lincoln is there. But he doesn't get the nomination. Why? Well, as Professor Slaughter says, one reason is that the convention is in Chicago, and Lincoln's supporters do some things, legitimate, maybe not so legitimate, to tilt the playing field in Lincoln's favor. But there are other reasons, and those Catholic children are certainly one of them. For many Republicans, Seward's, what they saw as his favoritism towards Catholics was unacceptable. Thaddeus Stevens, whom some of you might remember from the Lincoln movie, reportedly said that his state, Pennsylvania, would never vote for a man who ruined the common school system of New York to curry favor with Catholics and foreigners. And even Republicans who weren't prejudiced had to listen when leaders like Stevens said, if you nominate Seward, we're not going to win in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Illinois and Indiana. And in order to win, the Republicans were going to have to win essentially all of those states. So Seward does not get the nomination. And he's disappointed. And he knows that his friend Weed, who's in Chicago at the convention, is going to be even more disappointed. And he writes to Weed one of my favorite letters in the collection here, which is back there. I just noticed it. He writes that he hopes that Weed's disappointment will be as light as his own, because there's nothing that he, Seward, can think of that should have been done that wasn't, and nothing that was done that ought not to have been done. Seward masters his own disappointment and goes on to campaign for his rival Lincoln. And not in a minor way. He campaigns from Maine to Massachusetts, to Michigan, to Minnesota, to Missouri. He campaigns in almost every state of the North. No one does more to secure the election of Abraham Lincoln than his rival, William Henry Seward. So it's not actually that surprising that Lincoln rewards him by making him Secretary of State. They didn't know one another terribly well, but Seward, as the sort of leading Republican, was in some sense entitled to the position. During the secession winter, Seward is the leading advocate of compromise in Washington. And this makes him rather unpopular with his wife, Frances, back in Auburn. But he gives speeches, gives interviews, talking about how we need to buy time, to find some form of compromise with the South that will keep the southern states that are still in the Union, and will gradually lure back the states that have seceded. And that is his position up to the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. That is his position after the inauguration when Seward becomes Secretary of State. And so Seward opposes Lincoln's plan to send reinforcements to Fort Sumter. Seward predicts, rightly, that will lead to civil war. Once the war starts, Seward's focus shifts, and he begins to focus more on what you might call his job description of foreign policy. And he knows his history. He knows that during the Revolution, the critical moment is really when France recognizes the nascent United States. He knows that if Britain or France recognize the Confederacy, the game is in some sense up, that the Confederacy will survive in some form. And so in order to prevail, the Union must prevent one of the major European powers from recognizing or providing substantial support to the Confederacy. The Trent crisis is a good example, the best example, really, of Seward at work as a diplomat. So the Trent is a British merchant ship which was forcibly stopped by an aggressive Union naval captain who had heard a rumor, which proved true, that there were Confederate diplomats on this British ship. He seizes the 4 Confederates from the deck of the Trent, with wives and daughters wailing nearby, and puts them on his ship and steams off towards New York Harbor. When he gets to the United States, he's hailed as a hero. The House votes to give him a gold medal. But when the news reaches Britain, he's denounced as a villain. How could he, stop a neutral ship going between 2 neutral ports to seize these men from its decks? And Seward receives, things move slowly these days. There's no telegram between New York and London. Seward finally receives, shortly before Christmas, the formal demand of the British government: return the 4 Confederates and apologize. Lincoln's idea is that the U.S. should play for time. And we have actually Lincoln's draft of what Seward should say in response. It's sort of a legalistic document proposing international arbitration. Seward knows that that won't work. He knows the British will view that as an invasion. He knows that if that is the response, war with Britain is quite possible. And so, slowly, with difficulty, Seward brings Lincoln around and brings the cabinet around. There are two cabinet meetings which take most of Christmas Day and the day after Christmas. And by the end of it, Seward is able to hand to the newspapers his response to the British minister's request. He hands the newspapers a sort of whole package of materials which hits the papers all at once. When the news reaches England, people rise up in the theater in the evenings when it's announced and cheer, because they really don't want to war with the United States. And even more remarkable, when the news hits the newspapers here, people cheer as well. Most people thought that if the diplomats were given up, that Seward would be denounced, that he would be removed from office. But instead, people recognized that he's done something clever and important. He has managed to both adhere to traditional American diplomatic principles about free trade on the oceans, dating back to Jefferson and Madison, and he's avoided a war with Britain, which, even if we had won it, we would have lost the war with the Confederates. So that's Seward as diplomat. He's with one eye on the foreign, but with a very close eye on the domestic political. But Seward, as I hinted before, is not a man for limiting himself to his job description. He is involved in all aspects of the war. And in particular, he gives many more speeches than Lincoln does during the war. One of my favorites is in 1863, when the news arrives of the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Seward is in Washington. He steps out on his porch there on Lafayette Square, and he says that this is the beginning of the end, that the Confederacy is clearly coming to an end, and that before too long he expects actually to see Southern states begin to apply for permission to re-enter the Union. But he also notes that the Confederates had just been at Gettysburg. Things could go differently, and if they do go differently, he, Seward, intends to remain at his post in Washington, whatever happens. If I fall here, he says, let no friend or kinsman take my remains to some other place. Let me be buried beneath the pavement of the avenue, where the chariot wheels of those who have destroyed the freedom of my nation may ride over until another generation rises up to give it back its freedom and its independence. That, he tells his audience, is my resolution. Now, for yours. You should not assume that all of this will happen without you. You must fight for your union. You must, if necessary, die for your union. Ask not, he says, whether the enemy be near or far. Ask only whether there is an enemy arrayed against the United States, domestic or foreign, and array yourselves to meet that enemy. I'm not reading the precise words, but that is roughly what Senator Seward says. He gives even more speeches in the next year, 1864, the presidential election. I found a wonderful quote in the course of my current research, which I wish I'd found in the course of my Seward research. Seward's good friend, Charles Francis Adams, who's our representative in London throughout the war, said that of all the elections in which he'd been involved in his long life, 1864 was the only election that was as important as people claimed it was at the time. People are always saying, this is the most important presidential election of our generation. But 1864, Charles Francis Adams says, really was that important. And Seward was involved in that election in giving speeches, but he's involved in other ways too. One that I find particularly fascinating, and I hope some student is going to undertake and really drill to the bottom of, is the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Several thousand men work at the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and many of them are hostile to the administration. New York City, in general, is sort of Democratic territory, and the Naval Yard is a hotbed of Democratic sentiment. Seward thinks these men should be presented with sort of a simple choice. Vote for Lincoln or lose your jobs. And Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, is outraged. He in his diary writes, it says, this is the vicious New York school of politics in which Weed has tutored Seward for his lifetime. And the Brooklyn Daily Eagle is also outraged. It says that no man who won't vote for Lincoln can actually get a job at the Naval Yard. What I don't know, what I would love to know, is how these people actually voted in the election and how the pressure worked kind of on the ground. What I know is kind of the high-level debate in Washington, but I'd love to know more about what happened on the ground. As we think of the election of 1864, we tend to think that it was won when Sherman captured Atlanta. We forget how close it was and how close Lincoln and Seward thought it was going to be right up until the votes were cast. Lincoln does prevail, and he and Seward then kind of turn their attention to what next. They had initially been neutral on the constitutional amendment to end slavery as it made its way through the Senate in 1864 and was rejected in the House. But as those of you who've seen the Lincoln movie know, they changed their minds in late 64, early 65, and support the amendment, and indeed support it wholeheartedly. And I think it says volumes about Lincoln's relationship with Seward and Seward's own political skills that Lincoln doesn't turn to his private secretaries or to some friend in the Senate to get the bill through the House of Representatives. He turns to Seward. And Seward, in turn, relies on some shady lobbyists to help him get it through. And there's some great sort of vignettes. One of them is one of the letters, which is in the collection here, from one of these lobbyists to Seward. Says, "Don't worry about getting the amendment through the House. If patriotism fails, money will surely do the trick." There's another story about how after it's over, one of the lobbyists goes to one of the congressmen and says, well, what were your expenses during this exercise? And the guy said, well, you don't need to worry about that. He said, no, you must have incurred some expenses. What were they? And he said, well, I think they might have been, I don't know, $22.50. He said, my God, that's not how they do it in Albany. He gets the amendment through. And it would appear that he is going to be, continue to be Lincoln's right hand through Lincoln's second term. As we know, Lincoln doesn't live to carry out his second term. And on the night that he's assassinated, Seward is almost killed as well. The assassins target Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State Seward. Seward is in some respects a very easy target. He's in bed, he's been injured in a carriage accident, but he can't move, he can't fight. The assassin bursts into his bedroom with a pistol in one hand and a Bowie knife in the other. The pistol isn't working because the assassin has already used it to club Seward's son Frederick to an inch of his life outside the door. But the Bowie knife is in good working order. He presses Seward into the bed with one hand and slashes down with the Bowie knife. Mike here is not liking my acting out. He misses the first time, but connects at least 2, perhaps 3 times with Seward's face and neck, slashing him up sort of like a fish on a cutting board. And Fanny, who's in the room, is screaming, I think, this whole time. This brings her brother Augustus, for once actually on the scene, and a sergeant, army sergeant. They wrestle the assassin off of Seward, pull him sort of out of the room, suffering cuts themselves as he's sort of stabbing them to try to get them off him. He runs down the stairs. On the way out of the house, he stabs a State Department messenger with a good measure, leaving 6 people stabbed and bleeding in the house. All of whom actually miraculously survive, including Frederick, who drifts in and out of a coma for a month. Seward himself is back at his desk relatively quickly, continues to serve as our Secretary of State through the administration of Andrew Johnson. It's during that period that he purchases Alaska. The one thing that, when I tell people I'm working on Seward, the one thing that taxi drivers know about him is that Alaska was mocked as Seward's folly. Not really. When you read all the newspaper coverage, it's quite favorable. There is one newspaper that's quite opposed, edited by Seward's former friend, Horace Greeley, the Tribune. But in general, the newspaper coverage is quite favorable, and I think the real proof that it wasn't viewed as folly is that the Senate ratified the treaty within a couple weeks by a vote of 32 to 2. What was most interesting to me in doing this research was not, Alaska itself was interesting, particularly the sort of seamy lobbying that occurs to get it through the House of Representatives. But what was interesting to me was that Alaska was not, by any matter of means, the only bit of territory that Secretary Seward coveted and that he nearly acquired. He, among other things, signed a treaty to acquire the Virgin Islands at a price far below that which he ultimately paid for them. And he signed a treaty to acquire the rights to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. He was, in fact, a Panama maniac late in his life. He saw the Panama Canal as the key connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific. It was going to sort of make the United States a Pacific power. And it's interesting to think what would have happened if that treaty had been ratified in both the United States and Colombia, and we had acquired those rights to build the canal. He retires in '69, but he is not really very retired. He immediately almost launches off on travels, goes west to see California, Oregon, Washington Territory, his beloved Alaska. If you go to the Seward House, and I commend the Seward House to all of you, you'll see some of the mementos that he acquired in Alaska. Down to Mexico, Cuba, comes back for a couple months and sets out on a bigger trip around the world: Japan, China, India, the Middle East, Europe. He told his neighbors, when they asked about it, that he had discovered that at his age, rest was rust, and the only cure for the rust was to keep in motion. And that is what he did, more or less, until the day of his death in October of 1872. So, there, a brief overview. I could talk for a long time, but let me take some